Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will probably shatter everything you think you know about human evolution, ancient warriors, maritime exploration, and the secret education systems that shaped the greatest rulers in history. Picture this. You're standing face to face with a Neanderthal, and instead of the stooped, grunting caveman you've imagined, you're looking at what can only be described as nature's ultimate gym rat, with an oversized brain and a surprisingly sophisticated sense of style. Then imagine watching a lone female samurai decapitating enemies in medieval Japan while most women couldn't even speak in public. Add to that ancient seafarers crossing thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but stars and wave patterns, plus royal children being trained in secret schools that would make modern elite academies look like finger painting classes. Tonight's journey will take us through 4 incredible chapters of human achievement that Hollywood couldn't make up if it tried. We'll discover how our Neanderthal cousins weren't failed prototypes, but rather specialized success stories who could probably bench press a woolly mammoth while solving complex navigation problems. You'll meet Tomoe Gozen, a Japanese warrior woman who made grown samurai wet their armor just by showing up to battle, and you'll witness how she transformed from historical figure into immortal legend through sheer audacity and sword skills that would make anime characters jealous. We'll sail alongside ancient maritime cultures who turned the world's most dangerous oceans into superhighways of trade and cultural exchange, long before anyone had heard of GPS or even basic maps. These weren't lucky accidents. These were systematic conquests of the unknown by people who read the sea like we read street signs. And finally, we'll peek behind the curtain of ancient royal education systems, where future emperors and queens were forged through training regimens that combined Aristotelian philosophy, military combat, astronomical calculations, and political intrigue in ways that would exhaust a modern Harvard student. But here's the thing that will probably keep you up thinking tonight. Every single technique, innovation, and cultural breakthrough we'll explore was developed by people who had to survive in conditions that would kill most of us within hours. These weren't primitive humans stumbling through history. They were brilliant problem solvers who created solutions so effective that we're still discovering how sophisticated they really were. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, possibly while contemplating whether your ancestors could have survived a mammoth hunt or navigated the Pacific using only bird flight patterns. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a world where everything you thought you knew about human strength has just been completely demolished. The year is roughly 80,000 BCE, and you're standing in what will someday become Europe. Except right now, it's a frozen wasteland that makes Antarctica look like a tropical vacation. The air is so cold it literally hurts to breathe, and the landscape stretches endlessly in every direction. Just ice, rocks, and the occasional mammoth, wondering why it chose this particular geological era to exist. But something impossible is moving through this hellscape with the casual confidence of someone strolling through a mall. You're looking at a Neanderthal, and your brain is struggling to process what you're seeing, because this creature looks like it was designed by a committee of bodybuilders, Arctic engineers, and someone who really loved the idea of prominent forehead real estate. This isn't the slouching, knuckle-dragging caveman that's been burned into popular imagination by decades of questionable science education and cartoon depictions. What you're witnessing is evolution's answer to a very specific question. What would happen if you took a human and optimized every single component for surviving in conditions that would freeze a polar bear solid? The result is standing in front of you, and it's both terrifying and magnificent. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals should be classified as a separate species or simply a highly specialized branch of humanity. But what's undeniable is that they represent one of evolution's most successful experiments in environmental adaptation. These weren't proto-humans who failed to evolve properly. They were the ultimate specialists, fine-tuned for their world in ways that would make modern survival experts weep with envy. The Neanderthal you're observing moves with a peculiar combination of power and grace, like watching a tank that somehow learned to dance. Every step seems calculated to conserve energy while maintaining perfect balance on treacherous terrain. When this individual turns to look at you, those eyes aren't vacant or confused. They're sharp, intelligent, and possibly wondering why you look so ridiculously unprepared for basic survival in what they consider a perfectly reasonable climate. Your modern human body, designed for versatility and endurance across varied environments, suddenly feels like showing up to a heavy metal concert with a kazoo. You're not just physically outmatched, you're witnessing the culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection that produced something both familiar and utterly alien. Your eyes are struggling to process the sheer physical presence of what you're seeing, because this Neanderthal isn't just built differently. They're built like nature decided to create the ultimate heavy-duty human and then added some extra reinforcement just for fun. Standing roughly 5 feet 6 inches tall, they're not what you'd call short. They're what engineers would call compact. It's like someone took a regular person and ran them through a compression algorithm designed by someone obsessed with maximum efficiency and minimum heat loss. The stocky frame radiating power in front of you features shoulders so broad they could probably serve as a coffee table, and a rib cage so massive it looks like their respiratory system was designed by industrial bellows manufacturers. Those arms aren't just muscular, they're architectural marvels. With forearms so thick, they make modern weightlifters look like they've been skipping arm day for their entire lives. And those hands, massive, powerful appendages with thumbs so robust they could probably open pickle jars that would defeat entire families of modern humans. But it's the face that really stops you cold. This isn't the brutish, confused expression that Hollywood has trained you to expect. Those prominent brow ridges that could double as ski jumps frame eyes that are alert, intelligent, and possibly calculating whether you're worth the effort of a conversation. The nose is large and forward-facing, like a built-in heating system for frigid air, and the jaw projects with the kind of confidence that suggests this individual has never worried about whether they can chew through frozen meat. What makes this even more fascinating is that you're not looking at some failed evolutionary experiment. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals represent a dead-end branch of human development or simply a highly successful parallel adaptation. But the evidence increasingly points to the latter. These weren't humanity's embarrassing relatives who couldn't figure out how to evolve properly. They were evolution's elite special forces, custom designed for conditions that would turn modern humans into popsicles. The bone density alone is mind-boggling. Those femurs aren't just thick, they're like medieval architecture, built to support not just body weight, but the constant stress of hauling enormous prey across mountainous terrain while wearing what amounts to Ice Age work boots. The knee joints are shaped for endless squatting and climbing, perfect for someone whose daily routine involves activities that would hospitalize a modern athlete. Even more impressive is how this robust skeleton tells a story of constant use. Every bone shows evidence of massive muscle attachments, suggesting a lifestyle that involved lifting, hauling, throwing, and grappling with forces that would make modern strongman competitions look like yoga classes. The spine is reinforced like a suspension bridge, ready to handle loads that would snap lesser vertebrae like twigs. But here's where it gets really interesting. All this heavy-duty construction came with trade-offs. These individuals likely matured faster than modern humans, packing a lifetime of physical punishment into potentially shorter lifespans. Their bones show constant wear patterns, healed fractures, joint damage, and blunt force trauma that reads like a medical textbook on extreme sports injuries. Yet they kept going, kept hunting, kept surviving in conditions that make our worst winter days look like pleasant spring afternoons. The skull housing, that massive brain, tells its own story. Longer and flatter than modern human skulls, with thick walls that could probably stop a baseball, it provided protection for a brain that was actually larger than ours. Not metaphorically larger, literally bigger, with an average cranial capacity of 1,500 to 750 cubicentimeters compared to our modern 1,350. That's like discovering that the supposedly primitive cousins were walking around with supercharged engines while we've been puttering along with standard equipment. What's particularly remarkable is how this entire physical package worked together as an integrated system. The short, powerful limbs weren't just about strength, they were about heat conservation in brutal climates. The massive chest cavity housed lungs capable of extracting maximum oxygen from thin, cold air. The reinforced skeleton supported not just body weight, but the constant demands of a lifestyle that involved wrestling with megafauna on a regular basis. You're witnessing the result of natural selection's most successful experiment in environmental specialization. While our ancestors were developing the versatility that would eventually allow humans to spread across every continent, these individuals were becoming the ultimate survivors for one specific set of conditions. And in those conditions, they didn't just survive, they dominated, turning Ice Age Europe into their personal kingdom for nearly 300,000 years. But that massive skull wasn't just housing extra padding for protection against mammoth headbutts. It was containing what can only be described as a high-performance cranial engine that puts our modern brains to shame in terms of sheer volume. You're looking at individuals who were carrying around brains that averaged 1,500 to 750 cubic centimeters, compared to our supposedly advanced modern average of 1,350. That means the so-called primitive Neanderthals were literally walking around with bigger brains than the people who invented smartphones and managed to get confused by IKEA furniture assembly instructions. Now, before you start crowning them honorary professors of prehistoric universities, there's an important disclaimer that would make any neuroscientist chuckle. Bigger doesn't automatically mean smarter. A blue whale has a brain the size of a watermelon and has yet to invent indoor plumbing, compose poetry, or figure out how to avoid getting tangled in fishing nets. But here's what makes Neanderthal brains fascinating. They weren't just carrying around extra neural ballast for show. The distribution of that brain volume tells an incredible story about adaptation and specialization. A massive portion went towards sensory processing and motor coordination, especially visual processing and movement control. When your daily survival depends on tracking elk through blizzards, navigating treacherous mountain terrain without GPS, and coordinating complex toolmaking while your fingers are numb from cold, you need neural hardware that can handle multiple demanding tasks simultaneously. Their visual cortex was particularly enormous, likely giving them eyesight that would make a hawk jealous. Picture sharp-eyed, frost-covered Neanderthals squinting dramatically into howling winds, like characters from some epic Ice Age anime, except instead of dramatically monologuing about destiny, they're calculating wind patterns and tracking migration routes with the precision of organic supercomputers. Historians still argue whether the relatively smaller prefrontal cortex in Neanderthals indicates limited abstract thinking ability, or simply a different cognitive organization optimized for their lifestyle. But the evidence suggests they weren't just operating on instinct and aggression. Their lives required serious planning, cooperation, and problem-solving skills that would challenge modern humans. They had to predict seasonal changes, coordinate group hunts, remember complex geographical information, and manage social relationships within small, tightly knit communities. What's particularly impressive is how they adapted this neural hardware across dramatically different environments. Neanderthal populations spread from the dry steppes of Central Asia to the icy tundra of Northern Europe, from Mediterranean coastlines to high-altitude mountain valleys. Each environment required different survival strategies, tool technologies, and resource management approaches. This wasn't just physical adaptation, it was cognitive flexibility on a scale that required serious brain power. And then there's the creativity factor that completely demolishes the brutish caveman stereotype. Archaeological evidence shows Neanderthals creating art, jewelry, and symbolic objects that serve no obvious practical function, unless you count looking awesome as a survival strategy. They were grinding ochre into pigments, piercing shells to make beads, and possibly applying makeup thousands of years before anyone invented Instagram filters. Some cave paintings in Spain have been dated to over 64,000 years ago. That's before modern humans even arrived in Europe. The tool-making evidence is equally mind-blowing. These weren't people randomly bashing rocks together and hoping for the best. They were using sophisticated techniques like the Levallois method, which involves preparing stone cores in precise ways to predictably control the shape and sharpness of the flakes removed. It's like prehistoric quality control manufacturing, requiring spatial reasoning, planning ahead, and understanding of material properties that would impress modern engineers. Even more fascinating is evidence of their teaching and learning systems. Tool-making techniques were passed down through generations with remarkable consistency, suggesting they had developed educational methods for transferring complex knowledge. They weren't just making tools, they were running prehistoric technical training programs that ensured survival skills didn't die with individual experts. The language capabilities remain one of archaeology's most intriguing puzzles. They possessed the hyoid bone, crucial for speech production, and carried genetic variants associated with language processing in modern humans. While we'll never know if they composed epic poetry or told elaborate jokes around their fires, it's clear they had the hardware for sophisticated communication. Somewhere in Ice Age Europe, Neanderthals were having conversations that went far beyond mammoth that way and fire good. But perhaps most remarkably, they were innovating continuously. Their tool technologies became more sophisticated over time, their art grew more complex, and their adaptation strategies evolved to meet changing environmental challenges. This wasn't evolution doing all the work. This was conscious, deliberate improvement driven by intelligence, creativity, and the kind of problem-solving ability that turns environmental challenges into opportunities for advancement. If you've ever felt proud of your bone density after successfully carrying groceries up a flight of stairs without dropping anything, you should probably sit down for this next part. What you're witnessing in this Neanderthal isn't just impressive physical conditioning. It's the result of a lifestyle so brutal and demanding that it literally reshaped their entire skeletal system into something resembling medieval fortress architecture. We're talking about bones so thick and dense they make modern human skeletons look like discount chopsticks held together with optimism and prayer. The evidence comes from fossil records that read less like quiet archaeological reports and more like injury documentation from an Ice Age extreme sports competition, where the grand prize was not dying of starvation before winter. Take the famous Shanidar 1 specimen. This individual had survived a crushing blow to the head that left him partially blind, a withered right arm from what appears to be a massive healed break, and foot damage that would have made walking an adventure in pain management. Yet he lived for years after these injuries, which means his community was taking care of him. Because apparently, even if you're a walking medical emergency, your Ice Age buddies still make room for you at the fire. What makes these injury patterns so fascinating is how eerily similar they are to modern professional rodeo riders. And no, that's not a joke dreamed up by archaeologists with too much time on their hands. The types of fractures, the locations of bone damage, and the healing patterns all match what happens when you regularly tangle with large, angry animals that weigh approximately 1 ton and have serious attitude problems about being hunted. But these weren't just unlucky accidents or the results of particularly clumsy individuals. Historians still argue whether the high injury rates indicate reckless hunting practices or simply the inevitable consequences of a close contact hunting strategy. But what's clear is that Neanderthals preferred getting up close and personal with their dinner. Their weapons were primarily thrusting spears. Think stab rather than throw from a safe distance, which meant when you went after a woolly rhinoceros, you were essentially committing to a wrestling match with something that could crush you without breaking stride. The bone structure itself tells the story of individuals who lived every day like they were training for the world's most dangerous CrossFit competition. Those femurs weren't just short and robust for show. They were engineered to power through rough, mountainous terrain while carrying roughly half a reindeer on one shoulder. The muscle attachment points on every bone are massive, indicating the kind of muscle mass that comes from daily activities involving lifting, hauling, throwing, and occasionally moving boulders for entertainment purposes. Their arms tell an equally impressive story. The upper arm bones were incredibly thick, but it's the forearms that really make modern anatomy textbooks weep with inadequacy. Neanderthal forearms were proportionally thicker than any other hominin species, a unique adaptation that wasn't just for intimidation factor. These were the arms of people who wielded heavy tools, manipulated enormous prey, and probably had grip strength that could accidentally crush modern human hands during a friendly handshake. Even their rib cages were built like industrial equipment. While modern humans have barrel-shaped rib cages that taper toward the waist in an aesthetically pleasing manner, Neanderthals had wide, flaring rib cages that prioritized function over fashion. This gave them room for enormous lungs capable of extracting maximum oxygen from the cold, thin air of glacial Europe, basically nature's version of a turbocharged respiratory system. The spine tells perhaps the most remarkable story of all. Reinforced like a suspension bridge and designed to handle loads that would hospitalize modern humans, it supported not just their robust body weight but the constant demands of a lifestyle that made medieval peasant labor look like a relaxing spa day. Every vertebra shows evidence of massive muscle attachments, suggesting core strength that would make professional athletes jealous. But here's what makes this even more impressive. All this heavy-duty construction was paired with remarkable healing ability. Broken bones knitted back together, damaged joints continued functioning, and individuals with severe injuries kept participating in the demanding lifestyle that had injured them in the first place. They didn't have access to modern medicine, physical therapy, or pain management beyond whatever herbal remedies they could discover through trial and error that hopefully didn't involve too much error. The wear patterns on their teeth provide another window into their incredible physical capabilities. Neanderthal teeth show evidence of being used as tools, not just for eating, but for gripping materials while working with their hands, processing tough plant fibers, and probably opening things that would challenge modern bottle openers. Their entire body was essentially a multi-tool designed for survival in conditions that would turn most modern humans into historical footnotes within a matter of days. Picture weather so cold that your nose hairs become tiny icicles within seconds of breathing. And now imagine not just surviving in that environment, but actually thriving like it's your own personal tropical paradise. That's exactly what Neanderthals accomplished in Ice Age Europe, turning conditions that would make modern survival experts cry into their perfectly comfortable hometown environment. These weren't people barely clinging to life in a hostile world. They were nature's ultimate snow machines, engineered from head to toe to make the worst climate Earth could throw at them look like a minor inconvenience. The sheer brutality of their environment is hard for modern people to comprehend. We're talking about a European landscape that looked like someone had turned the entire continent into the world's most aggressive freezer section, complete with temperatures that regularly dropped well below what we consider unbearably cold, wind patterns that could knock you off your feet, and snowfall that lasted for months at a time. The kind of weather that makes you question whether leaving your heated house to check the mailbox is really worth the risk. But Neanderthals had turned environmental adaptation into an art form that would make modern engineers weep with envy. Their compact, stocky build wasn't just coincidence. It was the result of hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection, fine-tuning the human body for maximum heat retention. Long, lanky limbs lose heat faster than politicians lose credibility during election season. So Neanderthals evolved limbs so thick and short that even penguins would nod approvingly at their thermal efficiency design. Those massive noses weren't just prominent facial features. They were sophisticated biological HVAC systems built directly into their faces. The large nasal cavities warmed and humidified frigid air before it reached their lungs, essentially giving them a personal climate control system that required no external power source, and never broke down during the worst possible weather conditions. It's nature's version of central heating, except it's portable and doesn't require monthly utility bills. Their clothing technology was far more sophisticated than the popular image of fur-clad cavemen suggests. Archaeological evidence indicates they weren't just draping random animal skins over their shoulders and hoping for the best. Neanderthals were processing hides, softening them through complex techniques, and actually sewing garments together using bone needles with a precision that would impress modern tailors. They were creating fitted winter wear thousands of years before anyone invented buttons, zippers, or the concept of fashion seasons. Historians still argue whether Neanderthal clothing techniques were developed independently or influenced by early contact with modern humans. But what's undeniable is their effectiveness at keeping people alive in conditions that would freeze modern humans solid before they could complain about the wind chill factor. These weren't just functional garments. They were life support systems disguised as prehistoric fashion statements. The fire technology they mastered wasn't just about staying warm, though that was certainly a major benefit. Fire meant the difference between eating frozen raw meat that could crack your teeth and enjoying properly cooked meals that provided maximum nutritional value. It meant light during the endless winter nights when the sun barely made guest appearances above the horizon. It meant protection from predators that might otherwise view humans as convenient midnight snacks. But most importantly, fire gave them the ability to extend their living spaces into environments that would otherwise be completely uninhabitable. With controlled fire, a cave wasn't just a rocky shelter. It became a warm, dry home base where families could gather, tools could be manufactured, and knowledge could be passed down through storytelling and demonstration. Fire transformed survival from a constant, desperate struggle into a manageable way of life. Their hunting strategies were perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions and prey. While modern humans eventually developed long-distance projectile weapons that allowed relatively safe hunting from a distance, Neanderthals perfected the art of close-quarters combat with megafauna. They weren't just brave, they were strategically brilliant, using their understanding of animal behavior, terrain advantages, and group coordination to bring down prey that could easily kill individual hunters. The evidence suggests they weren't just randomly attacking whatever animals they encountered. Neanderthal hunting sites show clear evidence of planning, coordination, and sophisticated understanding of seasonal migration patterns. They knew when and where specific animals would be most vulnerable, how to drive herds into advantageous positions, and how to work together to maximize success while minimizing casualties. Even their social structures were optimized for Ice Age survival. Small, tight-knit groups that could move efficiently across the landscape while maintaining the cooperation necessary for complex hunting strategies and resource sharing. They weren't just individual survivors, they were functioning communities that took care of injured members, shared knowledge and skills, and maintained cultural traditions that helped everyone survive in conditions that would challenge even modern technology. The result was a population that didn't just endure the Ice Age, they completely dominated it, spreading across Europe and parts of Asia while adapting to local conditions with the confidence of apex predators who had figured out how to make the worst possible climate work in their favor. When most people picture Neanderthal fashion, they probably imagine something like a single mammoth hide draped over one shoulder, held in place with a piece of vine, accessorized with a wooden club, and a general aura of confusion about personal hygiene. But the reality of Neanderthal style was surprisingly sophisticated. Primitive by modern standards, sure, but with more functionality than flair, and just enough innovation to make medieval fashion designers question their life choices. Ice Age Europe wasn't exactly the ideal place to experiment with minimalist fashion trends. If you decided to venture outside wearing nothing but confidence and good intentions, you'd transform into a human popsicle faster than you could say tactical error in wardrobe selection. So Neanderthals developed clothing solutions that were ingenious, practical, and occasionally even stylish, assuming your definition of style includes successfully not dying of hypothermia while looking reasonably intimidating. The evidence suggests they weren't just wrapping themselves in animal skins like they were trying to cosplay as discount furniture covers. Neanderthals were actually processing hides, using techniques to soften and preserve them, then stitching pieces together with bone needles that demonstrate remarkable precision and planning. This isn't just throwing on whatever dead animal happened to be available. This was systematic garment construction that required understanding material properties, seasonal planning, and considerable patience. Archaeological sites have revealed bone needles, cutting tools specifically designed for hide processing, and evidence of complex preparation techniques that involved scraping, treating, and softening animal skins until they became workable materials. Some sites even show evidence of sewing techniques that involved piercing patterns and systematic construction methods that suggest they had developed standardized approaches to clothing manufacture. But Neanderthals weren't just focused on practical warmth and protection. They also had a surprising interest in personal accessories that served no obvious survival function. Eagle talons, pierced shells, and carefully crafted beads have been found at Neanderthal sites, suggesting they appreciated a little flair in their personal presentation. Maybe they were making fashion statements, sending social signals, or just enjoying the Ice Age equivalent of bling. Historians still argue whether these decorative elements were purely aesthetic choices or carried deeper symbolic meaning related to status, spiritual beliefs, or group identity. But what's certain is that someone was taking time and effort to create beautiful objects that went beyond basic survival needs. Imagine a Neanderthal examining their reflection in a still pool and thinking, you know what this outfit needs? Some carefully arranged eagle claws and a shell necklace that really brings out my prominent brow ridges. The use of ochre adds another fascinating dimension to Neanderthal personal care and decoration. This naturally occurring red pigment has been found at numerous sites, and not just scattered around randomly. It shows evidence of deliberate collection, processing, and application. Were they using it for body painting, decorating tools and clothing, creating the world's first makeup tutorials? The evidence suggests all of the above, indicating a level of personal grooming and aesthetic awareness that completely demolishes the dirty, unkempt caveman stereotype. Some researchers theorize that ochre use might have had practical applications beyond decoration. It could have served as a natural sunscreen, insect repellent, or antiseptic treatment for wounds. But the patterns of use and application strongly suggest that looking good was at least as important as any practical benefits. Someone was definitely concerned about their appearance and social presentation, which means Neanderthals had developed concepts of personal style thousands of years before anyone invented mirrors or fashion magazines. The sophistication of their clothing and accessory production also indicates complex social structures and knowledge-sharing systems. These techniques weren't simple enough to figure out independently. They required teaching, learning, and cultural transmission across generations. Young Neanderthals were learning garment construction, hide processing, and decoration techniques from experienced practitioners, creating educational systems that preserved and refined manufacturing knowledge over thousands of years. What makes this even more impressive is that all of this fashion and decoration activity was happening alongside the constant demands of Ice Age survival. These weren't people with unlimited leisure time to experiment with personal styling. They were individuals who had to hunt, gather, make tools, maintain fires, and defend against predators. Yet they still found time and energy to create beautiful, well-crafted clothing and accessories that demonstrated both technical skill and aesthetic sensibility. The evidence suggests that looking good wasn't considered a luxury or frivolous activity. It was an integral part of Neanderthals' social life and personal identity, important enough to justify the considerable time and effort required to create sophisticated garments and decorative elements that went far beyond basic survival necessities. Now let's talk about what happens when you combine those massive reinforced skeletons with a lifestyle that makes modern extreme sports look like gentle yoga sessions for elderly people with joint problems. Neanderthals weren't just strong in the way that makes you proud of carrying all the grocery bags in one trip. They were accidentally rip the door off your cave because you forgot to adjust for your own power. Strong. The kind of strength that makes you question whether the laws of physics were working differently back then, or if these individuals were just born with premium membership to the universe's fitness program. Archaeological evidence suggests that a male Neanderthal could be up to 50% stronger than a modern human of similar size, and in terms of upper body strength, possibly double our capabilities. This wasn't gym strength built through careful workout routines and protein supplements. This was functional power developed through daily activities that would hospitalize modern humans within hours. We're talking about people whose regular morning routine included tasks that would qualify as strongman competition events today. Their preferred hunting strategy perfectly demonstrates this incredible physical capability. While later human populations developed sophisticated projectile weapons that allowed hunting from relatively safe distances, Neanderthals perfected what can only be described as the run directly at dangerous megafauna and stab them at point-blank range approach to dinner procurement. Their spears were designed for thrusting rather than throwing, which meant every hunt was essentially a commitment to wrestling with animals that could crush them without breaking stride. The injury patterns we discussed earlier make perfect sense when you understand that Neanderthal hunting involved getting close enough to woolly rhinoceroses to have meaningful eye contact before attempting to introduce sharp objects to vital organs. This wasn't reckless behavior. It was a hunting strategy that required incredible strength, coordination, and confidence in their ability to overpower creatures that modern humans would only approach with high-powered rifles and extensive safety equipment. But their strength wasn't just about brute force application. It was integrated with remarkable resilience and recovery capabilities. The fossil record shows individuals who survived injuries that would be career-ending for modern athletes, then continued participating in the same demanding activities that had injured them in the first place. Broken ribs that healed while the individual kept hunting, crushed facial bones that didn't prevent continued tool use, damaged limbs that somehow remained functional enough for daily survival activities. Historians still argue whether this resilience indicates superior healing abilities or simply reflects the reality that taking time off for injury recovery wasn't an option in Ice Age survival situations, but the evidence suggests both factors were probably involved. These were people whose bodies had been optimized through natural selection for absorbing punishment and continuing to function under conditions that would break lesser physical specimens. Their grip strength alone was probably absurd by modern standards. Those massive hands with enlarged thumbs and thick fingers weren't just for show. They were precision instruments capable of manipulating heavy tools, controlling struggling prey, and probably accidentally crushing objects that modern humans handled delicately. Imagine trying to shake hands with someone whose casual grip strength could leave lasting impressions on your bones. The daily activities that built and maintained this incredible strength would challenge modern fitness enthusiasts. Hauling animal carcasses across rough terrain, processing tough hides without mechanical assistance, crafting tools from resistant materials using only hand-powered techniques, and maintaining equipment that required regular resharpening and repair through physical manipulation of hard stone and wood materials. Even their walking patterns were different. The robust leg bones and modified hip structure suggest they moved through their environment with a gait that maximized power and stability over speed and efficiency. This wasn't the long-distance running build that characterized later human populations. This was the body type of someone designed to carry heavy loads over difficult terrain while maintaining the strength and endurance necessary for surprise encounters with hostile wildlife. What makes this physical prowess even more remarkable is how it was combined with the fine motor control necessary for sophisticated tool manufacturing and artistic creation. These weren't just powerful brutes who could only accomplish tasks requiring maximum force. They had the delicate touch necessary to create precise stone tools, intricate decorative objects, and detailed cave paintings that required steady hands and careful attention to detail. The combination of raw physical power with refined technical skills created individuals who were essentially living multi-tools, capable of everything from heavy construction work to delicate artistic expression, all while maintaining the constant vigilance and quick reflexes necessary for survival in an environment filled with creatures that considered humans a convenient snack option. The thing about being that physically powerful and mentally sophisticated is that you don't just survive in extreme environments. You start developing culture, and not just the kind that grows on old cheese forgotten in prehistoric refrigeration systems. Archaeological evidence reveals that the same individuals who could dismember a mammoth in under 10 minutes also took time to carefully arrange flowers on graves, create intricate cave paintings, and possibly invent the world's first jewelry collections thousands of years before anyone figured out how to make shopping malls. Let's start with what might be the most emotionally striking evidence of Neanderthal cultural sophistication: intentional burials. Multiple sites across Europe show clear evidence of deliberate graves, often in carefully excavated shallow pits, sometimes with grave goods or traces of pollen that suggest flowers were placed with the deceased. Whether this represents spiritual beliefs, symbolic thinking, or just a prehistoric version of, "Grandpa really liked daisies, so we should probably include some," we may never definitively know, but the important point is that they cared enough to do something meaningful, rather than just leaving deceased family members behind a convenient boulder. The burial evidence completely demolishes any notion that Neanderthals were emotionally primitive or incapable of abstract thinking about death, memory, and relationships. These were people who mourned their losses, commemorated their dead, and invested time and energy in rituals that served no obvious survival function, unless you count maintaining group cohesion and emotional well-being as survival strategies, which honestly, any psychologist would tell you they absolutely are. But the cultural sophistication doesn't stop with funeral arrangements. For years, the scientific establishment assumed that art was exclusively a modern human achievement, something that separated us from them in terms of cognitive development. Then archaeologists discovered cave paintings in Spain, created with red ochre over 64,000 years ago, which created an awkward moment because that's before modern humans had even arrived in Europe to teach anyone about artistic expression. Historians still argue whether these early artworks represent true symbolic thinking or simply decorative impulses. But what's undeniable is that someone was taking time to create images that served no practical survival function, unless you count making cave walls look more interesting as essential prehistoric interior decorating. The paintings show evidence of planning, color selection, and compositional awareness that suggests considerably more sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities than anyone expected from supposedly primitive hominins. The jewelry and decorative object collections are equally impressive and puzzling. Neanderthal sites have yielded pierced shells, eagle talons, carefully shaped beads, and feathers that obviously required significant effort to obtain and process. These weren't practical tools disguised as accessories. They were purely decorative objects that someone valued enough to invest time and energy in creating, maintaining, and presumably wearing or displaying. Some of these decorative elements required considerable skill and planning to obtain. Eagle talons, for instance, meant either finding dead eagles, unlikely, or somehow capturing live ones, dangerous and difficult, then processing the claws in ways that made them suitable for jewelry. This suggests not just aesthetic appreciation, but also the kind of forward planning and risk assessment that indicates sophisticated decision-making abilities. The mysterious cave structure discovered in France adds another layer of cultural intrigue that continues to puzzle researchers. Deep underground, where no natural light could reach, someone had arranged broken stalagmites into circular patterns for no apparent practical purpose. No obvious utility, no evidence of habitation, just Neanderthals, 176,000 years ago, building geometric structures in complete darkness, like they were conducting some kind of prehistoric architectural experiment, or possibly just being weird in ways that we can't comprehend across the vast gulf of time. Music and sound production represent another fascinating possibility. While we have no direct evidence of Neanderthal musical instruments, they possessed the anatomical structures necessary for complex vocal production, and their demonstrated ability to work with bone, wood, and other materials suggests they could have created sound-producing devices if they were inclined to do so. Imagine Ice Age concerts, featuring primitive percussion ensembles and vocal performances that echoed through European caves. The sophistication of their tool traditions also indicates cultural transmission systems that went far beyond simple demonstration and imitation. The consistency of manufacturing techniques across different sites and time periods suggests they had developed educational methods for preserving and transferring complex knowledge, essentially running prehistoric technical training programs that ensured important skills didn't disappear when individual experts died. All of this cultural evidence paints a picture of people who weren't just focused on immediate survival needs, but were investing time and energy in activities that enriched their social lives, expressed individual creativity, and maintained group traditions across generations. They were living full, complex lives that included beauty, ceremony, and meaning, alongside the practical demands of Ice Age survival. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. And by interesting, we mean the kind of genetically verifiable prehistoric romance drama that would make modern dating apps seem incredibly boring by comparison. When early Homo sapiens migrated into Europe and Asia around 60,000 years ago, they encountered the locals, our Neanderthal friends. And rather than treating them like distant cousins at an awkward family reunion, they did the evolutionary equivalent of swiping right with absolutely zero hesitation or concern about long-term relationship compatibility. We know this happened because it's literally written in our genes, like the world's most permanent relationship status update. Most people of non-African descent today carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, which means somewhere in your very, very, very extended family tree, one of your ancestors had what can only be described as an Ice Age romance that got completely out of hand and left genetic evidence that's still detectable thousands of generations later. The mechanics of how these encounters actually occurred remain one of archaeology's most fascinating puzzles. Was it love at first sight across a frozen tundra? Strategic alliance building between different human groups? A prehistoric version of, well, the dating pool isn't exactly overflowing with options out here in glacial Europe? Historians still argue whether these interactions were primarily consensual romantic relationships or more complex social and political arrangements, but what's certain is that they happened repeatedly in multiple locations over thousands of years. Genetic analysis reveals that this wasn't just a one-time confused encounter at a particularly dark cave party. The interbreeding occurred multiple times across different geographical regions and time periods, suggesting ongoing contact and relationship formation between Neanderthal and modern human populations. Some areas show evidence of extended coexistence lasting thousands of years, during which the two groups apparently found each other attractive enough to produce viable offspring who survived to adulthood and continued the genetic mixing process. What makes this even more intriguing is that the genetic evidence shows directional preferences in the mixing patterns. Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females seem to produce offspring more frequently than the reverse combination, possibly due to social structures, migration patterns, or simply the irresistible charm of early human storytelling abilities, combined with slightly more refined tool-making techniques and possibly better conversation skills around the communal fire. The genetic legacy of these prehistoric relationships continues to influence modern human populations in ways that are both fascinating and occasionally problematic. Neanderthal DNA contributions have been linked to traits affecting skin pigmentation, hair texture, immune system responses, and even pain sensitivity. So if you sunburn easily, react strangely to certain medications, or feel like stubbing your toe causes disproportionate agony, you might be experiencing the lingering effects of Ice Age romance choices made by ancestors who probably never imagined their relationship decisions would still be affecting people tens of thousands of years later. But it's not all positive genetic inheritance. Some Neanderthal gene variants have also been associated with increased risks for conditions like type 2 diabetes, depression, and nicotine addiction. So while your ancient relatives might have helped you survive a woolly mammoth encounter, they might also be partially responsible for your tendency to stress eat cookies and scroll through social media at 2 in the morning instead of getting reasonable amounts of sleep like a responsible adult. The fact that these genetic contributions persist in modern populations also tells us something important about the nature of Neanderthal extinction. They didn't simply vanish from the earth like victims of some prehistoric catastrophe. They were gradually absorbed into the expanding human population through continued interbreeding until there were no longer any purely Neanderthal communities remaining. It's less tragic extinction and more ultimate romantic merger that resulted in their genetic material becoming permanently integrated into human evolution. This mixing process wasn't limited to Neanderthals either. African populations whose ancestors didn't migrate into Neanderthal territory show little to no Neanderthal DNA, but they do carry genetic material from other archaic human populations like the mysterious Denisovans, whose DNA shows up in modern Asian and Pacific Islander populations. The human family tree turns out to be less of a clean organizational chart and more of a romantically chaotic network of interconnected relationships that would challenge even the most sophisticated genealogy software. The implications of this genetic evidence completely transform how we understand human evolution and the relationship between different human populations. Rather than a simple linear progression from primitive to advanced, we're looking at a complex web of parallel development, cultural exchange, and genetic mixing that created the modern human genome through contributions from multiple archaic human populations who were all successful in their own ways. But our journey through human achievement doesn't end with Ice Age romance novels written in DNA. It shifts dramatically to a completely different time and place, where the concept of female warriors would have been considered either completely impossible or absolutely terrifying, depending on who you asked. Imagine the war-torn landscapes of Japan's Heian period, where the battlefield was supposedly no place for a woman, and yet, that's precisely where one of history's most legendary fighters carved out her place with sword skills that would make modern action movie choreographers weep with envy and inadequacy. Welcome to the extraordinary world of Tomoe Gozen, a warrior whose very existence challenges everything you thought you knew about medieval Japanese society, gender roles, and the probability of surviving hand-to-hand combat with someone who could decapitate opponents while riding a galloping horse without breaking stride or messing up her perfectly arranged hair. This wasn't some fictional character dreamed up by modern storytellers. This was a real woman who lived, fought, and became legend through sheer audacity and blade work that made grown samurai reconsider their career choices. Picture a sea of armored men clashing steel in the dust and chaos of civil war, and among them, one figure stands out not because she was out of place, but because she was more skilled, more fearless, and more precisely lethal than most of the professional warriors around her. Tomoe wasn't just participating in these battles, she was commanding troops, making strategic decisions, and personally collecting enemy heads as trophies, with the casual efficiency of someone who had turned warfare into a refined art form. Contemporary accounts describe her as remarkably beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features that could have made her successful in any number of peaceful pursuits. But those same sources were equally enthusiastic about her strength, her supernatural archery abilities, and her swordsmanship that apparently left witnesses struggling to find adequate superlatives. This wasn't just battlefield competence. This was artistic mastery of violence that happened to be packaged in a form that completely violated every social expectation of her era. The timing of her rise to prominence wasn't coincidental. Japan was being systematically torn apart in the Genpei War, a civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that was reshaping the entire political structure of the country. Feudal codes were being rewritten in blood, the samurai class was seizing control from court nobles, and in this vacuum of traditional authority, Tomoe carved out a space that no woman had ever dared claim before. right in the center of the action, sword drawn, giving orders that men twice her size followed without question. Her loyalty belonged to Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a prominent general whose ambitions were matched only by his willingness to defy every social convention that might limit his effectiveness, including the radical decision to treat Tomoe as his military equal, rather than keeping her safely distant from actual combat. This wasn't some protective gesture or token appointment. Yoshinaka recognized genuine talent and was smart enough to use it, regardless of whether it came in the expected packaging. Historians still argue whether Tomoe's exceptional status reflects broader opportunities for women in certain periods of Japanese history, or represents a unique individual who managed to transcend normal social limitations through sheer force of personality and skill. But what's undeniable is that she wasn't just accepted as a warrior. She was celebrated as one of the finest military leaders of her generation. Male or female, the Genpei War provided the perfect stage for someone with Tomoe's talents and ambitions. Battles were fought across rivers, through forests, over mountains, with arrows falling like monsoon rains, and hand-to-hand combat that left the earth soaked in blood and littered with evidence of individual skill and courage. This wasn't theoretical warfare conducted from safe distances. This was personal, brutal, and immediate, requiring not just physical capability, but strategic thinking, leadership presence, and the kind of nerves that remain steady when death is literally breathing down your neck. One of Tomoe's most famous victories occurred during the Battle of Yokotagawara, where chronicles report she led a charge that completely devastated enemy forces, personally taking multiple heads and presenting them as proof of her effectiveness. This wasn't unusual behavior for successful samurai. Head collection was standard practice for demonstrating battlefield achievement. But it was absolutely unprecedented for a woman to be accumulating these grisly trophies and using them to establish her reputation as a warrior worthy of respect and fear. But war wasn't just about glory and impressive trophy collections. It was also about loyalty, betrayal, and the kinds of political maneuvering that could transform military heroes into hunted fugitives faster than you could say ambitious cousin with imperial aspirations. As Yoshinaka's battlefield successes mounted and his political influence grew, tensions began rising with Minamoto no Yoritomo, who viewed his cousin's rapidly expanding power base as a direct threat to his own leadership of the clan and his carefully laid plans for controlling post-war Japan. The Minamoto family, already fractured by generations of pride, ego, and competing claims to authority, began turning inward like a snake eating its own tail, while the Taira remained the official enemy. Yoshinaka's string of brilliant military victories had earned him control over significant territory and resources, but success in feudal Japan was often more dangerous than failure, especially when that success made other powerful people nervous about their own positions in the emerging power structure. In 1183, after achieving what many thought impossible, Yoshinaka managed to drive the Taira completely out of Kyoto and establish control over the imperial court, making him temporarily the most powerful man in Japan. Standing beside him throughout this remarkable rise to prominence was Tomoe, blood-stained, loyal, and probably wondering whether political success was worth the inevitable complications that came with making enemies of your own family members. But controlling the imperial capital turned out to be significantly more challenging than conquering it. Yoshinaka had dreamed of restoring proper imperial authority and creating a more just political system, but the emperor and court nobles quickly realized that their new protector was just as uncontrollable and potentially dangerous as the previous regime. He began making demands that alarmed the traditional power structure, antagonized Kyoto's established elite with his rough provincial manners, and most catastrophically, attempted to assert direct control over Emperor Go-Toba in ways that looked suspiciously like a power grab disguised as protection. Historians still argue whether Yoshinaka's political missteps were the result of naive idealism, strategic miscalculation, or simply the inevitable consequences of trying to impose military solutions on complex political problems. But what's certain is that his behavior in Kyoto provided Yoritomo with exactly the justification he needed to brand his cousin a traitor and dispatch military forces to eliminate him as a political threat. The response was swift and merciless. Yoritomo sent two of his most trusted and capable generals, Minamoto no Noriyori and the legendary Minamoto no Yoshitsune, with clear orders to end Yoshinaka's political career permanently. What had begun as a war against the Taira had suddenly transformed into a Minamoto civil war, with Tomoe finding herself in the impossible position of fighting not just against traditional enemies, but against members of her own extended clan family. What followed was a rapid and tragic descent from the heights of political power to the desperate circumstances of military fugitives. Yoshinaka, who had once commanded armies and controlled imperial policy, found himself retreating from Kyoto with only a handful of loyal retainers, including Tomoe, who remained at his side despite the increasingly obvious reality that this story was not heading toward a happy ending for anyone involved in Yoshinaka's political adventure. The final retreat wasn't just a military withdrawal, it was a complete collapse of everything Yoshinaka had built and hoped to achieve. His dreams of reforming Japanese politics, his ambitions for creating a more just society, his vision of proper imperial governance, all of it crumbling as enemy forces closed in, and former allies either abandoned him or actively joined the pursuit forces hunting him across the Japanese countryside. For Tomoe, this meant transitioning from celebrated military commander to hunted fugitive. But her loyalty never wavered, even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. She had tied her fate to Yoshinaka's cause, and she was apparently prepared to see that commitment through to whatever end awaited them, whether that meant death in battle, capture and execution, or some other conclusion to their remarkable but doomed political and military partnership. The stage was now set for what would become one of Japanese military history's most famous and tragic final battles, where personal loyalty, warrior honor, and the brutal realities of feudal politics would collide in ways that would transform historical figures into timeless legends, ensuring that their names and stories would be remembered long after the specific political circumstances that created their rise and fall had been forgotten by everyone except dedicated historians and storytellers. Snow blanketed the battlefield in February of 1184, and the plains of Awazu were eerily quiet, the kind of ominous silence that makes experienced warriors check their weapons twice and wonder whether they've made terrible life choices that led to this particular frozen moment of truth. Minamoto no Yoshinaka stood with only a few dozen men remaining from what had once been a formidable army, surrounded by hundreds of enemy warriors led by Yoshitsune and Noriyori, who had arrived with enough military force to crush any reasonable hope of survival or escape. The odds were so hopeless they bordered on mathematical impossibility. Yet Tomoe Gozen remained at Yoshinaka's side. Apparently unbothered by minor details like being outnumbered 10-1 by professional killers who had traveled considerable distances specifically to ensure that neither she nor her lord would see another sunrise. This wasn't optimistic military planning. This was a deliberate choice to face certain death with dignity, style, and the kind of spectacular final performance that would give storytellers material for centuries to come. According to the legendary Heike Monogatari, which became the definitive account of these events, Tomoe didn't retreat, surrender, or attempt any reasonable survival strategies that modern military advisors would recommend. Instead, she surged forward like a human whirlwind, actively seeking the strongest and most dangerous opponent she could identify in the enemy ranks, because apparently her approach to impossible odds was to find the most challenging part of an already lethal situation and attack it directly. Her target was Hatakayama Shigetada, a renowned warrior in his own right, who probably thought he was having a relatively normal day of battlefield combat until a legendary female samurai decided to make him the centerpiece of her final dramatic performance. Whether driven by fury, desperation, or simple refusal to die quietly, Tomoe engaged him in single combat with the kind of intensity that turns individual fights into the stuff of epic poetry and historical documentation. The encounter was brief, decisive, and absolutely devastating from Shigetada's perspective. Tomoe locked blades with him, unseated him from his horse, and decapitated him in one fluid motion that demonstrated years of training, perfect timing, and the kind of sword technique that makes other warriors pause their own fighting just to appreciate superior craftsmanship. This wasn't just combat effectiveness. This was artistry expressed through violence, a final masterpiece created under the most extreme possible circumstances. One final trophy, one perfect demonstration of samurai ethos in action, one last message to anyone who might question whether a woman belonged on the battlefield alongside the greatest warriors of her generation. The head collection wasn't about bloodthirsty brutality. It was about proof, reputation, and the ancient understanding that individual excellence should be documented in ways that couldn't be disputed or forgotten by later generations of doubters. Meanwhile, Yoshinaka's own final moments were unfolding with the kind of dramatic irony that makes historical tragedies so emotionally powerful. His horse became trapped in a rice paddy, leaving him vulnerable to a volley of arrows that ended his remarkable but ultimately doomed political and military career. His loyal companion Imai Kanehira chose ritual suicide, leaping from his horse with his sword positioned for maximum dramatic effect, ensuring that Yoshinaka's inner circle would be completely extinguished in a matter of minutes. But here's where the historical record becomes frustratingly uncertain and endlessly fascinating. What exactly happened to Tomoe after her spectacular final charge remains one of Japanese history's most intriguing mysteries. The Heike Monogatari offers several conflicting accounts. One version claims Yoshinaka ordered her to flee before his death, fearing that dying alongside a woman would be considered shameful for a samurai general, which creates an ironic situation where the fiercest warrior on the battlefield was being dismissed to protect someone else's posthumous reputation. Historians still argue whether these various ending scenarios reflect different oral traditions, political considerations by later chroniclers, or simply the reality that nobody was paying close attention to accurate record-keeping during a chaotic battle where most of the participants were focused on not getting killed, rather than documenting who went where when the fighting ended. Other versions suggest she refused any orders to retreat, fought her way out through enemy lines, and vanished into the mountains where she could have continued living as a ronin, become a nun, or simply disappeared into legend like a warrior ghost who chose her own ending rather than accepting whatever fate the victorious political forces might have planned for captured enemies. What we do know with certainty is that her last recorded act wasn't one of surrender, compromise, or quiet acceptance. It was pure defiance, expressed through superior swordsmanship and the kind of battlefield presence that left witnesses struggling to find adequate words for what they had seen. After the blood-soaked snows of Owazu melted and spring returned to Japan, Tomoe Gozen had completely vanished from official historical records, as if she had ridden straight off that battlefield and directly into the realm of myth, leaving behind nothing but conflicting stories, unanswered questions, and the kind of mysterious disappearance that transforms historical figures into immortal legends who belong to everyone and no one simultaneously. No historian can definitively say what happened to her, and perhaps that's exactly fitting for a warrior whose entire existence had been about defying expectations, breaking rules, and refusing to be contained by the limitations that society tried to impose on her. The uncertainty surrounding her fate has given generations of artists, scholars, revolutionaries, and dreamers permission to fill that void with whatever meaning they needed her story to carry. The Heike Monogatari, which serves as our primary source for Tomoe's life and military career, offers several different endings that can't all be true, but somehow all feel appropriate for someone whose story was always larger than historical documentation could properly contain. One account claims she was captured and forced to marry Wada Yoshimori, one of Yoritomo's generals, bearing him children and eventually becoming a nun after his death, retreating from the world of steel and politics into quiet religious contemplation and hopefully some well-deserved peace. Another version suggests she cut off her long warrior's hair, assumed a completely new identity, and disappeared into the mountain monasteries of Nagano, never to be seen again by anyone who had known her during her military career. This ending appeals to people who like the idea that Tomoe chose anonymity and spiritual pursuits, over the complications of trying to maintain her warrior identity in a political environment that had become increasingly hostile to everything she represented. Yet another tale hints that she continued wandering the Japanese countryside as a masterless samurai, hiring herself out for private conflicts and border disputes, living as a professional warrior whose skills were available to anyone willing to pay her fees and respect her conditions. This version creates the appealing image of Tomoe as an independent contractor of violence, beholden to no lord or political faction, free to choose her own battles and define her own terms of engagement. But the most intriguing possibility is that she simply chose to vanish completely, walking away from history and into legend on her own terms, rather than allowing political circumstances or social expectations to determine her story's conclusion. By disappearing without explanation, she achieved something that most historical figures never manage: complete control over her own narrative legacy. Because when nobody knows how your story ends, it never really has to end at all. Historians still argue whether the multiple conflicting accounts of Tomoe's fate reflect genuine uncertainty among contemporary sources, or represent later chroniclers creating different versions to serve various political and cultural purposes. But what's undeniable is that her mysterious disappearance has proven more powerful than any definitive conclusion could have been. The Japan that emerged after the Genpei War was dramatically different from the world where Tomoe had flourished as a military leader. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo created a rigid patriarchal political system where women were increasingly pushed into background roles, marginalized from positions of authority, and expected to influence events only through their relationships with powerful men, rather than through direct action and personal achievement. Female warriors didn't completely disappear from Japanese history, but they became increasingly rare, romanticized, and confined to exceptional circumstances rather than being accepted as normal participants in military and political life. The cultural space that had allowed Tomoe to exist and thrive was systematically eliminated as Japan developed more structured, hierarchical social systems that left little room for individual women to achieve the kind of prominence and independence she had enjoyed. Yet somehow, Tomoe's memory endured and even flourished in this increasingly restrictive environment. She became a figure that mothers could reference when teaching daughters about strength and possibility, that soldiers could invoke when discussing courage and skill, and that artists could use to explore themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and the complex relationship between individual excellence and social conformity. Her story survived not in dusty official chronicles that few people would ever read, but in the popular culture that shapes how societies understand themselves and their possibilities. Through oral traditions, folk tales, artistic representations, and eventually modern manga, anime, and film adaptations, Tomoe became proof that extraordinary individuals could transcend the limitations of their historical circumstances and become timeless symbols of human potential and defiance. As centuries drifted by like seasons across the Japanese landscape, the woman who had once terrorized battlefields gradually transformed into something even more powerful than a historical figure. She became an immortal symbol that could be reshaped, reinterpreted, and reimagined by every generation that needed proof that extraordinary individuals could transcend the boundaries society tried to impose on them. The evolution of Tomoe's legend reveals as much about changing cultural values and social aspirations as it does about her actual historical achievements. The Heike Monogatari wasn't just a historical record, it was performance art, recited by blind monks known as Biwa Hoshi, who traveled from town to town, chanting the epic stories of the Genpei War to audiences who gathered to hear tales of courage, loyalty, and spectacular violence set to the haunting music of traditional string instruments. Through these performances, Tomoe was reborn not just as a fighter, but as a tragic heroine whose beauty was matched only by her loyalty and whose military skills were balanced by profound emotional depth. Later theatrical adaptations in Noh and kabuki drama transformed her story even further, emphasizing different aspects of her character depending on the artistic goals and social concerns of each era. Sometimes she appeared as the perfect embodiment of female loyalty, tearfully bidding farewell to her doomed lord, with elegant speeches about duty and sacrifice. Other times she was portrayed as a supernatural figure whose martial prowess transcended normal human limitations, capable of feats that bordered on the magical. But these romanticized portrayals came with a cost that reflects the broader challenges faced by powerful women throughout history. The real Tomoe, the one who decapitated enemies with casual efficiency and commanded troops with unquestioned authority, was gradually softened, domesticated, and made more palatable to audiences who preferred their female heroes to be tragic and beautiful rather than competent and potentially threatening to established power structures. Her armor was often replaced with flowing kimono in artistic depictions. Her sword techniques became metaphors for feminine resilience rather than literal combat skills, and her strategic brilliance was reframed as intuitive wisdom rather than learned military expertise. The woman who had carved her reputation through superior blade work was slowly transformed into a more acceptable version of female strength that emphasized emotional qualities over physical capabilities. Yet even these sanitized versions couldn't completely erase the fundamental power of her story. Throughout the Edo period, when samurai culture was becoming increasingly formalized and ritualized into rigid codes of conduct, Tomoe's image continued to appear in art, literature, and popular entertainment as a reminder that the warrior ideal could transcend gender boundaries when circumstances demanded exceptional responses to extraordinary challenges. Artists painted her riding into battle with serene determination. Sword schools included her in their lineages of martial paragons, and storytellers continued invoking her name whenever they needed an example of someone who had achieved the impossible through skill, courage, an absolute refusal to accept limitations that others considered inevitable and permanent. Historians still argue whether these artistic interpretations preserved or distorted the historical reality of Tomoe's life and achievements. But what's undeniable is that her legend provided a cultural resource that could be drawn upon whenever Japanese society needed to grapple with questions about women's capabilities, individual excellence, and the relationship between personal achievement and social expectations. During the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, when Japan was modernizing rapidly and redefining its national identity in response to Western influence, Tomoe re-emerged as a patriotic symbol who demonstrated that Japanese women had always possessed the strength and courage necessary to defend their homeland. School textbooks included her story alongside male samurai legends, and her image appeared in propaganda that emphasized traditional Japanese values, while simultaneously arguing for women's expanded roles in modern society. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Tomoe's appeal has only grown stronger, as global culture has become more receptive to stories about powerful women who refuse to be constrained by conventional expectations. Modern manga artists, video game developers, feminist scholars, and filmmakers have discovered in her story a perfect combination of historical authenticity and inspirational symbolism that speaks to contemporary concerns about gender equality, individual empowerment, and the ongoing struggle to create societies that judge people by their capabilities rather than their demographic categories. Today, Tomoe appears in everything from serious historical dramas to fantastical anime adventures, sometimes as a historically accurate warrior, and sometimes as a supernatural figure whose legend has evolved far beyond its original historical context. But regardless of how her story is told, she remains proof that some individuals are powerful enough to transcend their historical circumstances and become eternal symbols of human potential and resistance to limitation. But while Tomoe was carving her legendary path through Japanese battlefields with supernatural sword skills and strategic brilliance, an entirely different chapter of human achievement was unfolding across the world's oceans, where ancient mariners were accomplishing feats of navigation and exploration that would make modern GPS-dependent travelers question their basic competence and sense of direction. Before satellites lit up the sky with positioning data and compasses provided reliable magnetic guidance, seafaring cultures were staring out over endless horizons and asking the most audacious question imaginable. What's out there, beyond the edge of everything we can see? These weren't reckless fools, throwing themselves into the unknown, armed with nothing but optimism and poorly constructed rafts. They were engineers, navigators, and visionary explorers who understood that the ocean wasn't an impassable barrier, but rather the world's first superhighway, connecting distant lands and cultures in ways that would reshape human civilization forever. With little more than stars overhead, wind patterns, and an almost supernatural ability to read natural signs, they carved sea routes that became the foundational arteries of global trade, cultural exchange, and human migration. Humanity's relationship with the sea began tens of thousands of years ago, with some of the earliest evidence of watercraft dating back over 40,000 years, long before agriculture, writing systems, or any of the other innovations we typically associate with advanced civilization. Even then, early humans were using rafts and primitive boats to reach distant islands like Australia, which required crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean with no guarantee of finding land, fresh water, or anything other than a watery grave for their ambitious maritime experiments. These weren't lucky accidents or desperate survival attempts. They were planned expeditions undertaken by people who had developed systematic understanding of tides, wind patterns, and celestial navigation techniques that they passed down through generations via oral traditions, sacred stories, and practical training programs that would challenge modern maritime academies. By 3000 BCE, maritime technology was flourishing across multiple civilizations, with cultures in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and along the Nile River already using sophisticated boats for trade, fishing, and exploration that connected previously isolated communities. But the real transformation occurred when certain cultures made the bold decision to venture beyond coastal waters and familiar landmarks into the terrifying vastness of the open ocean, where navigation required skills that bordered on the supernatural, and survival depended on reading environmental clues with the precision of organic computers programmed for maritime excellence. These early oceanic explorers faced challenges that would overwhelm modern sailors equipped with satellite communication, weather forecasting, and emergency rescue services. They had no written charts, no backup navigation systems, and often no guarantee they would ever return to tell others about their discoveries. Yet they went anyway, driven by curiosity, necessity, economic opportunity, and the kind of adventurous spirit that views impossible odds as interesting challenges rather than sensible reasons to stay safely on dry land where the most dangerous wildlife consists of insects and the occasional irritated farm animal. The night sky became their primary navigation tool, with specific stars and constellations serving as celestial guideposts that could provide directional information and seasonal timing data essential for successful ocean crossings. Polaris in the northern hemisphere offered a reliable fixed reference point, while southern navigators learned to read the Southern Cross and other stellar configurations with accuracy that would impress modern astronomers armed with computerized telescope systems. But stellar navigation was just one component of a complex knowledge system that included understanding ocean currents, wave patterns, wind behavior, cloud formations, bird migration routes, and dozens of other environmental indicators that experienced navigators could interpret like a three-dimensional textbook written in natural phenomena rather than words and diagrams. Historians still argue whether these navigation techniques were developed independently by multiple cultures or spread through contact and cultural exchange between seafaring communities. But what's certain is that ancient mariners created a global network of oceanic knowledge that enabled human expansion across every major body of water on Earth, connecting continents and islands in ways that laid the foundation for all subsequent maritime exploration, trade, and cultural exchange that continues to shape our interconnected modern world. Long before the glory of Athens, or the magnificent architectural achievements that would make Rome famous, the island of Crete was home to one of the most sophisticated seafaring civilizations the ancient world had ever witnessed. The Minoans, who flourished from around 2700 to 1100 BCE and turned the Mediterranean into their personal maritime empire. Through a combination of advanced shipbuilding technology, fearless exploration, and what can only be described as an absolutely obsessive relationship with everything ocean-related. These weren't just islanders who happened to live near water. They were maritime architects who transformed the sea into a superhighway of culture, commerce, and political influence that reached every corner of the known world. At the heart of Minoan power was the incredible palace complex of Knossos, a sprawling architectural marvel adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting dolphins, ships, and sea life. With such artistic sophistication that it's clear these people didn't just live near the ocean. They lived and breathed maritime culture in ways that made the sea an integral part of their identity, spirituality, and daily existence. These weren't decorative flourishes added by artists with time to kill. They were declarations of a civilization that had made the ocean the center of their entire worldview and economic system. Unlike later Greek navies that were primarily designed for warfare and conquest, Minoan ships were engineered for speed, stability, and cargo capacity, making them ideal for the kind of long-distance trade missions and diplomatic expeditions that connected the Aegean world with Egypt, the Levant, and civilizations far beyond the Mediterranean basin. Their vessels, often decorated with bird or bull motifs that reflected their religious beliefs and cultural values, used innovative combinations of square sails and rowing systems that allowed them to navigate efficiently in both calm conditions and the unpredictable weather patterns that could turn Mediterranean sailing into a life-threatening adventure. The Minoans weren't just moving goods across the water. They were operating as cultural ambassadors, carrying ideas, artistic techniques, religious concepts, and technological innovations between civilizations that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other for centuries. They transported everything from olive oil and wine to pottery and bronze tools, but more importantly, they carried the kinds of intangible cultural exports that would influence art, religion, and social development across the entire Mediterranean world. How did they manage these remarkable feats of navigation without modern instruments or detailed charts? While no surviving Minoan navigational documents have been discovered, archaeologists believe they relied on sophisticated combinations of star-based navigation, visual landmark recognition, and systematic observation of environmental patterns, including watercolor changes, bird flight paths, and seasonal wind behaviors that experienced navigators could read like a comprehensive maritime instruction manual written in natural phenomena. Their consistent success in returning from long-distance voyages suggests they had developed incredibly detailed knowledge of Mediterranean sailing conditions, including understanding of monsoon patterns, current behaviors, and seasonal weather cycles that allowed them to plan expeditions with confidence and precision that would impress modern maritime logistics experts equipped with satellite weather data and computerized route optimization systems. But the Minoans weren't just successful traders and explorers. They were also cultural innovators whose maritime activities contributed to some of history's most significant intellectual developments. Through their extensive contacts with Near Eastern cultures, particularly the Phoenicians, they played a crucial role in the eventual development of the Greek alphabet, helping to spread writing systems that would become foundational to Western civilization and literary culture. Historians still argue whether Minoan maritime dominance was primarily economic, political, or cultural in nature. But what's undeniable is their ships weren't just trading vessels. They were floating ambassadors of a sophisticated civilization that understood the ocean as an opportunity for connection rather than a barrier to be feared and avoided. The mysterious end of Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE may have been connected to the very maritime environment they had mastered so successfully. A massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, possibly triggered tsunamis and ash clouds that devastated Minoan ports, disrupted their trade networks, and destabilized the maritime infrastructure that had been the foundation of their political and economic power for over a millennium. Whether their civilization ended due to natural disaster, military invasion, or internal political collapse, the Minoans left behind a legacy that extended far beyond archaeological ruins and museum artifacts. They had demonstrated that mastery of maritime technology could transform a small island culture into a major civilizational force, proving that control of sea routes was equivalent to control of the ancient world's most important economic and cultural networks. If the Minoans were the artistic visionaries of ancient seafaring, then the Phoenicians were its tireless entrepreneurs and technological innovators, dominating maritime commerce from around 1200 to 300 BCE through a combination of superior shipbuilding, fearless exploration, and business strategies that would make modern multinational corporations envious of their market penetration and brand recognition. These weren't people with a unified kingdom or magnificent capital city. What they had was something far more powerful: ships, and lots of them, plus the maritime expertise to use those vessels for transforming the entire Mediterranean world into their personal trading network. The Phoenicians emerged from a loose confederation of city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, each functioning as an independent maritime powerhouse that specialized in different aspects of international commerce, while sharing the common goal of turning every accessible coastline into a potential business opportunity. Their ships were sleek, fast, and remarkably maneuverable vessels capable of both coastal navigation and long-distance ocean crossings, using innovative combinations of square sails and banks of oars that allowed them to adapt to any weather conditions or sailing requirements they might encounter during their extensive commercial expeditions. What made the Phoenicians absolutely revolutionary wasn't just their shipbuilding technology. It was their approach to maritime commerce as a systematic, organized industry rather than random trading opportunities pursued by individual adventurers. They established permanent outposts and colonies across Mediterranean coastlines, creating a network of strategically positioned ports that served as supply bases, repair facilities, and regional headquarters for their expanding commercial empire that eventually stretched from Spain to the Black Sea. The most famous of these colonial establishments was Carthage in North Africa, which would later grow powerful enough to challenge Rome for control of the entire Mediterranean world, proving that successful maritime commerce could evolve into serious political and military influence when managed by people who understood the connection between economic power and territorial control. Each Phoenician colony functioned like a node in a vast commercial network, with the mother cities back in the eastern Mediterranean reaping the benefits of trans-Mediterranean trade relationships that connected previously isolated regional economies. But their greatest contribution to human civilization wasn't cargo transportation or colonial expansion. It was the development of the alphabet, a revolutionary writing system that would eventually inspire Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic scripts through a process of cultural transmission that occurred primarily via maritime trade routes and commercial relationships. The Phoenician alphabet, developed around 1050 BCE, represented a dramatic leap forward in human communication technology, featuring just 22 characters that represented sounds rather than entire words or complex syllables. This alphabetic innovation spread throughout the ancient world, not through military conquest or religious conversion, but through the practical necessities of international commerce, conducted by traders who needed efficient methods for recording transactions, documenting agreements, and maintaining correspondence with business partners scattered across thousands of miles of Mediterranean coastline. Every time a Phoenician merchant completed a trade deal, signed a contract, or sent a business letter, they were inadvertently spreading one of humanity's most important technological innovations. How did they manage to navigate such vast distances with no modern instruments or communication systems? Like their Minoan predecessors, Phoenicians used stellar navigation techniques, particularly focusing on Polaris as their primary directional reference, combined with systematic observation of wind patterns, current behaviors, and coastal features that allowed experienced navigators to find their way across open water with remarkable accuracy and consistency. They also understood seasonal sailing patterns in ways that enabled them to optimize their travel schedules for maximum safety and efficiency, avoiding dangerous weather periods while taking advantage of favorable winds and currents that could significantly reduce travel times and minimize the risks associated with long-distance ocean navigation in vessels that were sophisticated for their era, but still completely dependent on human skill and natural forces. Historians still argue whether Phoenician navigation techniques represented entirely original innovations or were influenced by earlier maritime cultures like the Minoans. But what's undeniable is their systematic approach to oceanic exploration and commercial exploitation that transformed the Mediterranean from a collection of isolated regional markets into an integrated economic system where goods, ideas, and cultural influences could flow freely between distant civilizations. The Phoenicians didn't just trade material goods. They connected cultures, languages, and knowledge systems in ways that accelerated human development across multiple continents. They turned the ocean from a barrier that separated peoples into a bridge that linked them, proving that maritime expertise could be more powerful than military conquest for creating lasting influence and establishing civilizational legacies that would continue shaping human history long after their ships had disappeared from Mediterranean waters. While the Mediterranean civilizations were busy establishing their maritime empires and trading networks, an entirely different seafaring saga was unfolding on the opposite side of the planet. One involving outrigger canoes, double-hulled voyaging vessels, and navigation techniques so sophisticated that they make modern GPS technology look like a convenient but ultimately unnecessary luxury for people who have forgotten how to read the natural world. The Austronesian seafarers, and particularly the legendary Polynesian wayfinders, didn't just sail the oceans. They systematically conquered the largest body of water on Earth through a combination of advanced boat-building technology, supernatural navigation skills, and the kind of maritime courage that turns impossible distances into achievable destinations. Originating from what is now Taiwan around 5,000 years ago, these maritime peoples expanded steadily southward and eastward in a process of island-hopping exploration that covered distances so vast they challenged modern understanding of what ancient peoples could accomplish without metal tools, written navigation charts, or any of the technological assistance that contemporary ocean explorers consider absolutely essential for survival in open water conditions. By 1500 BCE, they had reached the Philippines, Indonesia, and the edges of New Guinea. By 1000 BCE, they were establishing settlements in Micronesia and Melanesia. And by the 1st centuries CE, they had achieved the seemingly impossible by reaching Madagascar to the west and Easter Island to the east. An arc of human migration spanning over 10,000 miles of some of the most challenging ocean territory on the planet. Their vessels were absolute marvels of engineering that would impress modern boat designers with their innovative solutions to oceanic travel challenges. Austronesian navigators developed outrigger canoes that provided incredible stability in rough seas, and later created double-hulled voyaging canoes capable of carrying entire families, livestock, agricultural supplies, and everything else needed to establish permanent settlements on previously uninhabited islands thousands of miles from their departure points. These weren't just boats. They were floating migration vehicles designed for one-way journeys into the unknown, with no backup plans or rescue options if things went wrong. The navigation techniques they developed were so advanced and precise that they continued to baffle European explorers well into the modern era. When Western sailors armed with compasses, charts, and navigational instruments encountered Polynesian navigators who could pinpoint their location and destination with accuracy that seemed supernatural to people who had never learned to read the ocean, like a three-dimensional map written in wave patterns, bird behavior, and celestial movements. Polynesian wayfinders used the sun, moon, planets, and more than 200 individual stars as navigational guides, but that was just the beginning of their environmental literacy. They could detect subtle changes in wave patterns caused by distant islands reflecting swells back toward their vessels, creating interference patterns that experienced navigators could interpret to determine the direction and approximate distance to land masses that were still completely invisible below the horizon. They followed seabird flight paths with systematic precision, understanding which species fed close to shore and returned to land at specific times of day, providing reliable directional information even when no other landmarks were visible. They studied cloud formations that indicated the presence of islands through atmospheric patterns created by land masses affecting local weather systems, and they could even taste seawater to detect salinity changes that occurred near islands where fresh water mixed with ocean currents. Historians still argue whether these navigation techniques were developed through systematic scientific observation or represented cultural knowledge accumulated over generations of trial and error exploration. But what's undeniable is their effectiveness for enabling human settlement of Pacific islands that were previously completely isolated from human contact. The migration wasn't random wandering or accidental discovery. It was intentional, systematic exploration that could be repeated successfully by different groups following established routes and navigation protocols. This wasn't just island hopping or casual coastal exploration. These were deliberate colonization expeditions that established permanent settlements, introduced agriculture, and domesticated animals to previously uninhabited ecosystems, and created cultural networks that connected some of the most remote locations on Earth through ongoing trade relationships and social connections that persisted for thousands of years. They weren't just crossing oceans. They were building the world's largest maritime civilization, turning the Pacific from an empty wasteland into a connected cultural region where ideas, goods, and people could travel freely across distances that European explorers would later consider impossible to navigate without advanced technology and extensive support systems. The genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence continues to reveal just how extensive and sophisticated Austronesian maritime achievements really were, proving that these ancient navigators accomplished one of history's most remarkable feats of exploration and colonization, using nothing but human intelligence, environmental observation, and vessels that were perfectly adapted to their challenging oceanic environment. The story of ancient maritime mastery doesn't end with Pacific island hoppers or Mediterranean trading empires. It culminates in the recognition that long before modern maps, GPS satellites, and diesel-powered cargo ships connected our globalized world, ancient seafaring cultures had already created an invisible network of oceanic highways, drawn not with ink and paper, but with accumulated wisdom, environmental observation, and the kind of navigational courage that transforms empty horizons into pathways toward human connection and cultural exchange. These weren't primitive peoples stumbling accidentally across water bodies. They were sophisticated maritime engineers who understood that the ocean wasn't humanity's greatest barrier, but rather its most powerful tool for linking distant civilizations and sharing the innovations that would accelerate human development across every continent. From the reed boats navigating the Nile to the double-hulled canoes crossing the Pacific, from Minoan trading vessels connecting Mediterranean cultures to Phoenician ships spreading alphabetic writing systems, these early maritime pioneers didn't just explore unknown waters, they created the foundational infrastructure for everything we now consider normal about international trade, cultural exchange, and global communication. Their discoveries weren't isolated achievements that died with individual explorers. They were cumulative contributions to a growing body of nautical knowledge that each generation refined, expanded, and passed down through training systems that preserved essential survival techniques across thousands of years. The knowledge systems developed by these ancient navigators became the intellectual foundation for all subsequent maritime exploration and commercial activity. Phoenician alphabets enabled the record-keeping necessary for complex international trade relationships. Austronesian navigation traditions, preserved orally for generations, inspired 20th century efforts to revive traditional wayfinding techniques that had been nearly lost to modern technological dependence. Greek astronomical observations and wind pattern documentation laid the groundwork for ancient geography and cartographic science that would eventually evolve into modern navigation systems. Even more significant than their technological contributions were the cultural connections that maritime routes enabled throughout the ancient world. Ideas traveled faster by sea than by land, religions spread along oceanic trade routes, and technological innovations could cross continents in months rather than centuries, through networks established by fearless navigators who understood that isolation was humanity's greatest enemy and connection was its most powerful survival strategy. Without these ancient seafaring cultures, the Silk Roads would have ended at coastlines, empires might never have achieved intercontinental influence, and distant peoples would have remained permanently separated by geographical barriers that seemed impossible to overcome. But perhaps most remarkably, so many of these groundbreaking navigators and maritime innovators remained anonymous, their individual names lost to time, even as their collective achievements continue to shape our interconnected modern world. Their stories survive not in personal memoirs or detailed biographical accounts, but in fragments of evidence scattered across archaeological sites, pottery shards in sunken cargo holds, harbor structures buried beneath modern coastal developments, star charts carved into bone or bark, and the genetic evidence of human migration patterns that tell stories of courage and exploration that no written history could adequately capture. Their impact still moves with every tide, influences every shipping route, and echoes in every technological innovation that connects distant places and peoples. Every container ship crossing the Suez Canal, every satellite-guided cargo vessel traversing the Pacific, every naval patrol maintaining security in international waters owes something fundamental to those first brave individuals who looked at endless oceanic horizons and decided that the unknown was an invitation rather than a warning, that distance was a challenge rather than a barrier, and that the greatest human adventures would always involve leaving familiar shores to discover what waited beyond the edge of everything previously known and explored. They may have lived in ancient times, but they were never primitive in their thinking or limited in their ambitions. They were the original navigators of human possibility, proving that courage combined with knowledge could overcome any natural obstacle, and that the drive to explore, connect, and discover would always be among humanity's most powerful and transformative characteristics, capable of reshaping entire civilizations and creating legacies that would inspire exploration and connection for thousands of years into an unknowable but infinitely promising future. Word count 92. The weight of centuries presses gently against your consciousness as you realize that every story we've explored tonight connects you to an unbroken chain of human achievement, stretching back through countless generations of ancestors who refused to accept limitations, who transformed impossible challenges into opportunities for growth and discovery, and who understood that the greatest adventures always require leaving behind the safety of familiar territory to explore the vast possibilities that wait beyond every horizon. The Neanderthals, who survived Ice Age Europe with strength and intelligence that would humble modern humans, Tomoe Gozen, who carved her place in samurai history through pure determination and superior blade work, the ancient mariners who turned empty oceans into highways of human connection. All of them understood something we sometimes forget in our comfortable modern world, that human potential has no boundaries except those we choose to accept, and that every generation has the opportunity to achieve things that previous generations considered impossible. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let these ancient voices whisper their secrets in your dreams. Let the strength of Neanderthal bones merge with the courage of samurai swords. Let the wisdom of oceanic navigation blend with the mystery of royal education systems that shaped the greatest leaders in human history. These stories aren't just historical curiosities gathering dust in academic libraries. They're proof that extraordinary achievement has always been possible for people brave enough to attempt what others considered impossible, smart enough to learn from both success and failure, and persistent enough to continue pushing forward even when the odds seemed overwhelmingly against them. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers through time. Rest well in the knowledge that you carry within yourself the same potential for greatness that enabled our ancestors to survive ice ages, cross impossible oceans, create lasting art and literature, and build civilizations that continue to inspire us thousands of years after their creators return to dust. The future is still being written, and your chapter has yet to be completed.